So, what's the first thing that pops into your head when you hear the words Victory Garden? I bet it's those old black and white photos, right? Smiling families in their backyards, digging up the lawn, all doing their part for the war. It's a really powerful, kind of comforting image. But what if I told you that cozy, grassroots story, well, it isn't the whole picture, not by a long shot. Plant a victory garden. Our food is fighting. I mean, you've seen the posters. It was the call to action that everyone remembers. It just screams voluntary duty, doesn't it? Communities getting together to help out the troops. It's the perfect picture of the home front. Or at least that's how it seemed. And this is where the story starts to get way more interesting. The question right here is everything. Was it really a choice? For millions and millions of people, this wasn't some nice little hobby to pick up. It was an absolute stone-cold necessity. Okay, let's really get into this. The Victory Garden we think we know wasn't some spontaneous movement that just bubbled up from the people. No way. It was an incredibly sophisticated, state-run program. A massive piece of the Allied war machine, born not just from a sense of patriotism, but from sheer desperate need. So to understand how this all came to be, we've got to deconstruct that myth. We need to look at the crises that were happening that made these little backyard plots an absolute requirement for survival. The basic idea, it's simple enough. Regular folks growing food wherever they possibly could. We're talking lawns, city parks, vacant lots next to factories, you name it, they dug it up. But the reasons this was happening, they were wildly different on each side of the Atlantic. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. Take a look at the contrast here. In the US, the problem was logistics. You had farm workers getting drafted, and the military needed a huge chunk, over half, of all commercially canned vegetables. So the goal of home gardens was to feed the people at home so the big industrial farms could focus on feeding the army. But in the UK, the situation was absolutely dire. They imported 70% of their food. German U-boats were constantly sinking their supply ships, literally trying to starve the entire island into submission. Their slogan, "Spades, not ships," wasn't just catchy, it was a literal strategy for national survival. So, if growing food is that critical to the war effort, you can't just cross your fingers and hope people figure it out, right? You have to build an entire system to make it happen. You have to create a war machine that runs on dirt. And this was the huge, almost impossible challenge. Most people lived in cities and suburbs. They had no idea how to grow food. And an unskilled gardener, they could waste precious seeds, tools, and fertilizer that the country just couldn't afford to lose. The government knew this, and they launched one of the biggest, most intense educational campaigns in history to stop that from happening. And the propaganda effort was just incredible. It came right from the very top, with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt digging up part of the White House lawn to plant a garden, but it was also all over pop culture. You had Mickey Mouse getting in on the auction with a green thumb contest. In Britain, you had these cartoon characters like Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete trying to make root vegetables sound exciting. And the BBC's gardening show, it reached 3.5 million listeners every single week, becoming this essential calming ritual in the middle of all that chaos. But look, this wasn't just about morale, it was deeply scientific. The USDA was publishing these manuals with incredibly specific advice, like the exact 5-10-5 fertilizer ratio you needed for that tough, compacted city soil. They told people precisely which crops to plant for the most nutrition, think kale and spinach. And this was brilliant. They framed gardening as a manufacturing process, which made growing a tomato feel just as important to the war effort as building a fighter plane. So, the big question. Did this massive top-down machine actually work? Well, the numbers are just staggering. They really are. But the human story behind those numbers is even more complex. Okay, by 1943, how many of these gardens were there? An estimated 20 million. 20 million. Individual victory gardens just in the United States. Let that number sink in. And their output? Just as mind-blowing. In 1944, these little backyard gardens, run by total amateurs, produced 40% of all the fresh fruits and vegetables eaten in the entire country. 40%! But growing the food was only half the job, right? You had to preserve it. In 1943 alone, Americans canned over 4.1 billion jars of food. And this was only possible because of a huge network of over 6,000 community canning centers, where people could go and share essential rationed gear like pressure canners. So who was doing all of this incredible work? With millions of men fighting overseas, it was overwhelmingly women who took charge. They were the ones leading the charge in the gardens and in those vital canning centers. And in doing so, They were totally changing their role in the home and in their communities. But we have to acknowledge a much darker and, frankly, a deeply paradoxical part of this story. While suburban families were out there gardening for civic duty, the 120,000 Japanese Americans who were forcibly sent to incarceration camps, they were often forced to garden for completely different reasons. In these desolate, barren camps, they had to cultivate the land just to make the camps survivable. For them, it wasn't about patriotism. It was a strategy for survival, a way to get enough food and to hold on to a piece of their culture in the face of a terrible injustice. After the war ended, the Victory Garden faded away, almost as fast as it appeared. But its legacy is powerful, and it has found a whole new life in the crises of our own time. This timeline really tells the whole story. After that wartime peak, the 1950s brought us the supermarket and the new suburban dream of a perfect, manicured green lawn, not a vegetable patch. But then you see these revivals start to happen. Recession gardens popped up during the 2008 financial crisis, and then, of course, the massive boom in pandemic gardening in 2020, which is now really morphed into a modern movement focused on things like climate resilience and food justice. And the reasons people garden now are different, but they're also so connected to the past. People are still gardening for food security, sure, but also for mental health, for climate action, cutting down on food miles, and as a real tool for social justice, fighting food deserts in urban neighborhoods. It's the same act of planting a seed, but with a whole new set of victories in mind. The pandemic was, without a doubt, the biggest trigger for this in 75 years. When we were faced with empty grocery shelves and the incredible stress of lockdown, an estimated 1/3 of all Americans started a garden. It was a direct echo of the past, turning back to the land, back to self-reliance, in a moment of huge global uncertainty. Which kind of leaves us with this final thought. The Victory Garden was never really just a garden. It was a response to a crisis, a tool for resilience when systems were failing. And it really makes you wonder, in our own fragile, interconnected world, as we face all new kinds of crises, is the simple, radical act of planting a seed more important now than ever before?